Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Unit 2, and let's talk about voting and elections. It's interesting to note that the original Constitution didn't really say a whole lot about elections. It pretty much said that if you could vote in state elections, then you could vote in national elections. So essentially, election qualifications were left up to the states, and most states did pretty much the same thing. You had to be at least 21, you had to be a landowner, you had to be white, and you had to be male. Well, soon, at least by 1860, the landowning portion of it was dropped and white males could vote. And I picked 1860 because it's the beginning of the Civil War. Well, as you know, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed African-American men to join the Army, and 200,000 joined the Union Army, over 38,000 die. And so the argument became, if you're able to fight and die for your country, then shouldn't you be able to vote, have some say-so in that policy that may lead you to fight and die? And voting would be the way to do it. So the passage of the 15th Amendment allowed that African-American men could vote. It says the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, creed, color, or previous condition of servitude. It could still be denied on gender, obviously, as that is not mentioned in that amendment. Now, there were a lot of southern states who didn't like this at all. They felt that that African-American men were not qualified enough to vote. They didn't have the education, the background, and that was probably true, but that was also true of millions of white voters. More than likely is that, especially in the South, they did not want African-Americans voting because they would vote with the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. So southern states began passing a series of laws designed to prevent African-Americans and poor people from voting. So for example, the grandfather clause, which said that if your grandfather was not eligible to vote in the 1860 election, national election, then you were not eligible to vote either. Well, as you can imagine, that really disenfranchised most African-Americans because their grandfathers were probably slaves in 1860 and therefore not eligible to vote. This grandfather clause is struck down by the Supreme Court in Gwynn versus Oklahoma, I think 1919. It's not that relevant that you know it. Another thing that was used to stop African Americans from voting was the poll tax, which is that you had to pay a tax before you could even register to vote. And in 1900, that was like $1, but $1 could buy a week's worth of groceries. And so that was a significant amount of money. The poll tax was eventually struck down in federal elections by the 24th Amendment, and then in other state elections through a series of Supreme Court cases. Another idea was the all-white primary, or the white primary. This was created in Texas, where they said that the Democratic Party was a private club, essentially, only open to white people, and therefore African Americans could not vote. Now, as we'll talk a little bit later when we talk about the history of parties in Texas, Texas was a one-party state dominated by Democrats. And so if you weren't allowed to vote in the Democratic primary, then you really didn't have a say on who was going to get elected. The all-white primary, or the white primary, was struck down in the 1944 case of Smith versus Allwright. That struck down the all-white primary. Still, another attempt was the literacy test, which suggested that you would have to take a test before you would be eligible to vote. Now, the test was bizarre. You can look them up online and find them where they're asking you about geometry. Some of them asked you about Beowulf. Some of them asked about the Canterbury Tales. One literacy test in Alabama even asked people, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? Well, obviously, they were all designed to make sure that you failed, and they were very effective at doing that, making people fail the test. Now, the literacy test was never used in Texas, but was eventually suspended by, notice I didn't say outlawed, but suspended by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Other attempts were that they would say that you'd have to live someplace for 2 to 3 years before you could achieve residency. This is, again, attempted to really hit poor people and African Americans who tended to be sharecroppers or tenant farmers who moved from place to place. and therefore would never be able to get voting access. They would never be able to have residency. Through a series of Supreme Court cases, the numbers now are 30 days for national elections and 55 days maximum for state and local elections. Most states now use 30. 30 days are all across the board. So to expand voting rights even further, now that we've gotten through these laws designed to prevent poor people and African Americans from voting, there was a move on to get women to vote as well. 1868, Wyoming becomes the first territory to allow women to vote, and then later becomes the first state. And then eventually we get to the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women's right to vote. It's interesting to note that when that is passed in 1920, no state east of the Mississippi had granted women the right to vote up until that point. The idea that behind the 19th Amendment was that politics was corrupt, and that if you allowed women to vote, they would clean up the corruption, because under Victorian era beliefs, women were morally superior to men. The next law that we want to talk about is the 26th Amendment. Now, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. This was during the Vietnam War. You could be drafted at 18 and have to fight and die. And the argument was, look, if you can be drafted and fight to die, you should have the right to vote. So you again have that say so in the policy by having the right to vote. Now today, in states, voting qualifications are pretty much the same. You have to be a resident of the state, a US citizen, and at least 18 years of age to vote. Now, some people can be denied the right to vote. If you've been declared mentally incompetent, you cannot vote. If you're in prison or on parole, you cannot vote, or on probation. Now, there have been some moves recently to change that once you get out of prison, that you get your vote back automatically. Across the country, some have done it, some have not. But that's a move that's going on. Also, you cannot vote if you don't have a residence. In other words, if you're homeless and then you can't place where you live, you can't vote. Now, there are people that will go find the homeless and say, look, put down the shelter as your residency, and then we'll come and get you to vote. So voting is seen as a right, not necessarily as a privilege as it used to be. I think we do ask you about who votes in this study guide. And of course, the number one impact on whether you vote or not tends to be education. The more education you have, the more likely you're going to vote. Not saying you're going to vote, but the more likely you're going to vote. Your age has an impact on it, and your book says income, but I sort of skip the income part because education and income are so intertwined together. But those are the three major factors. You also tend to vote if you're a member of a union, because you're getting pressure put onto you, or if you're in a business where government policy has a direct impact on you. For example, in Iowa, where corn is the major crop, corn growers are subsidized by the federal government through ethanol subsidies and other subsidies. So you can find every politician, left and right, will go to Iowa when they're running for president, and none of them will ever talk about getting rid of those corn subsidies, because they know those people vote, because they have a direct economic interest in what the government's policy is going to be. So let's talk about voter turnout. Now, voter turnout in the United States and in Texas is just awful. It's low. Texas usually ranks around 49th or 50th in voter turnout. With presidential elections, up until this moment, this last election in 2020, usually since 1968, under 50%. We never got above that. And then in governor elections, around 30%. Local elections, it can drop to 5%. It's very low. People don't vote. And there could be a lot of reasons why people don't vote. Let's talk about some of them. Some of it's apathy. You just don't care. A lot of people may have given up on the political system. It's just something that's not on their radar. Another issue is ignorance. People don't know when elections are a lot of times. When I'm in my regular class, I'll say, when's the next time you vote? And no one knows. It's just not as out there as it could be. Also, the reason that people don't vote often is that they suffer from election burnout. There's so many elections that people get tired of it. And to be fair, doesn't it seem like today that we're on a constant 24/7, 365-day-a-year campaign? Somebody's always campaigning somewhere, especially through social media. And that leads to some burnout. Also, when we vote is an issue. We vote on a Tuesday, and a lot of people are working or at school, and so they don't get out to vote, even though we have had some early voting. And then another reason that people don't vote is that they don't think their vote counts. It does count, especially in local elections. I've seen in my city, we had a tie once, somebody won by 1 vote. Your vote does count. In fact, you know, if you go back to the 2016 election, Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million people. But he won that election because in certain key states, he won enough, roughly 50,000 votes over Hillary Clinton in certain key states, combined 50,000, that gave him the presidency. And that could have happened again this last time. He could have lost by 7 million, but still won some key close races in Arizona, in Georgia, and in Pennsylvania. George Bush won the presidency essentially over about 538 votes in 2000 over Al Gore in Florida. 538 votes. Your vote does count. So how can we get people to vote is a good question. There are a lot of ways we could do it. We could do same-day registration, where people can register to vote in the same day they vote. A lot of states do that, as opposed to having to wait 30 days before the election to get registered, and after that you can't. We can do early voting. We've been doing that for some time. Early voting allows people to vote up to 3 weeks in some states early, so they can go at any time. In Tarrant County, you can go anywhere in Tarrant County, no matter where you live, and vote at an early voting station. Computers allow us to do a lot of things that we weren't able to do before. Now, we've seen a move on lately about restricting early voting for some reason. That's been out there. We can also do, and we have done motor voter, where you go in and you get your driver's license. You can also register to vote at that same time to try to get more people to register to vote. We could do absentee voting, which we do. If you're not going to be around, you can still request a ballot and mail in the ballot. By the way, some states, that's all they do, is they just have mail-in ballots. So if you think that there's some massive fraud with mail-in ballots, there are states, I think Utah is one of them, that do all mail-in ballots, interestingly enough. And I really haven't checked what their voter turnout is. I don't know. I should check into that. Maybe I will later today. You can also do compulsory voting. Compulsory voting is that if you don't vote, you get fined. And they do this in Australia. You pay a fine if you don't vote. I don't know if that will really go very well in America. I think people believe they have the right to vote and they have the right not to vote. So we can do all those things to try to get more people to vote. And I think it's incumbent on us right now to talk about voter fraud. No matter what you hear in the news, I mean, if you do the research on that, it's a very, very, very rare event. It just doesn't happen in person. People don't go and try to vote 2 or 3 times in person. It's over the last 20 years, the percentages have been 0, 0, 0, 1, something along those lines. And mainly, problems with voting has been with mail-in voting, that some people have filled out the ballot for their spouse. But voter fraud in general is tends to be a non-existent problem. I know that's hard for some people out in the public to understand, because they want to believe it, because whenever their side loses, they want to assume that that's the case, or that somehow they could have lost. They lost because of some outside sources. Usually that's not the case. They lost because they weren't an effective candidate often. So when you look at voter fraud, we've had a couple of cases here in Texas, not so much as you would think. One was out of Forest Hill, I believe. A lady believed that she had paid her dues to society after being in jail, tried to vote, and was not allowed to vote. And that only filed a provisional ballot. She got 5 years in prison for that, which seems a bit odd, but whatever. And then we had another lady who thought she was eligible to vote and wasn't, because she wasn't a citizen. And I think they scheduled her for 8 years in prison for that. So voting is something that we all need to do, regardless of your political affiliation. Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Socialist, I don't know, all the other different parties. It's important that everybody votes and everybody has access to vote. So that's a little bit about voting that we'll talk about today. I'll do another video tomorrow talking about elections. And I'll keep trying to do these as much as I can until they may chase me out of my office at some point. I don't know. All right. You guys have a good rest of the day.